CHAPTER IV of the Giant Killer, or the Battle which All Must Fight. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Giant Killer, or the Battle which All Must Fight, by Charlotte Maria Tucker. Chapter 4. Giant Selfishness. "Do you know, mamma," said Laura the next day, as she and her sister sat alone with their mother, the boys being at lessons in the study, "do you know that I did not feel inclined to get up when I was called? But the clock began to strike, which put Giant Sloth into my head, and up I jumped in a minute." "I am glad that you made such practical use of my little tale," replied Mrs. Roby with a smile. "But, mamma, if I might say something," began Bertha, then hesitated and paused. "Say anything that you please, my dear." "I almost wondered at your beginning with only Giant Sloth. That seems such a little fault compared with the great ones of the Probyns. Constantine did not seem hit at all, for he is active enough in mischief." "I repeat that I hit no one," replied her mother. "Oh, but you know what I mean, mamma. I should have liked something very—very—" Bertha's face had a puzzled look, for she knew not how to express her meaning. "I should have liked some story that would have made them know themselves, and hate their faults as every one else must hate them. I would have had a horrible Giant Selfishness," she added, her manner becoming more excited as she spoke. "You look upon Selfishness, then, as their grand enemy?" "Oh, mamma, can anything be plainer? They are made up of selfishness, nothing but selfishness. They never think of the comfort of any one. I am sure that I wish they had never come here to torment us." Her cheek flushed, and her eye filled as she spoke. "Come, come, my love, if you are so warm on the subject, I shall suspect that the poor Probyns are not the only ones here who feel the power of Giant Selfishness." "Mamma, what do you mean?" said Bertha, in surprise. "I am convinced that you would suffer far less from the conduct of these boys if there were not something in your own nature of the same quality which you so strongly condemn in them." "I never thought that you would have accused me of selfishness," said Bertha, with a good deal more of sullenness in her tone than might have been expected from a child so well brought up. "What makes you feel so extremely annoyed when your pleasures are interfered with, your little amusements interrupted, your time broken in upon, your things wanted for others?" "No one likes to be put out of their way," replied Bertha. "No one likes it, my love, and selfishness is a quality to which, I fear, very few indeed are strangers." "My brother and sister do not think me selfish. I would do anything for them." "You love them, and love makes all things easy. Besides that, it seems to me that they seldom put your self–denial to any great trial. To attend your brother, to work for him, to carry out his little plans, has been your greatest amusement. And as for Laura—" The child had just left the room to bring her forgotten spelling–book. "She is such a sweet–tempered little creature that there could be no merit in showing kindness to her." "Then why are these boys brought here to make me selfish when I was not so before?" cried Bertha, with bitter emotion. "They seem to have brought all sorts of evil with them. Even Aleck does not appear the same that he was. He is not half so much with his sisters. They are filling my heart with such angry feelings. I shall never be good while they are here." "They are teaching you to know yourself, my Bertha. They are not causing the selfishness in your soul. They are only tearing away the veil which prevented you from knowing that it was there. A gilt object may appear as well as a gold one until it is tried in the fire. It is the furnace of temptation which proves of what metal we are made. A lake looks clear and pure while perfectly still. The oar which stirs up the sand from below is not the cause of the sand being there. It lays in the depths before, like evil in the depths of our hearts." Bertha heaved a deep sigh. "It is very painful to find out that we are so much worse than we thought ourselves," she said. "The discovery is painful, but very valuable. You would not go to meet an enemy blindfold. You must see him before you can fight him. You must know your faults before you can subdue them." Bertha felt the truth of her mother's words, and instead of only dwelling on the failings of their guests, she applied the lesson to herself, when her mother read to the assembled children the story of Giant Selfishness. Giant Selfishness sat in his bower, which was all garlanded over with flowers. The honeysuckle twined round its slender pillars. Damask roses and white, tinged with a pale blush, clambered over the roof; while around a marble basin, from which a bright fountain tossed its sparkling waters in the sun, the geranium scattered its delicate blossoms, and the fuchsia shook its crimson tassels in the breeze. A fair bower it was, for it had been adorned by Pleasure, the willing servant and attendant on its lord. Giant Selfishness was huge of stature and strong of limb, taller and more powerful than his younger brother Sloth. There were few indeed who could cope with his arm. He was tyrant over half the world. Many a great conqueror he had made his slave. Thousands and thousands had felt his chains. He claimed dominion over young and old. Yet now, as the giant sat alone, a deep shade of gloom was upon his massive brow. He listened not to the tinkling fall of the fountain. He glanced not at the beautiful flowers. "Evil tidings, evil tidings," he muttered to himself. "Sloth has been the first victim, but he will not be the last. I dread nothing on earth but the invincible sword. Not even my strength can stand against that." He pressed his vast hand over his eyes, and remained for some moments in thought. "Ha! I have it!" he exclaimed, suddenly raising his head. "What force cannot accomplish, cunning may perform." He clapped his hands as a signal, and the noise that they made was startling as a peal of thunder. Instant at the summons, his servant Pleasure appeared. A fairy-like creature, with gossamer wings, all sparkling with the tints of the rainbow. "Pleasure," exclaimed the giant, "I call thee to my aid against him who would root out the race of Selfishness. Knowest thou if Fides is still at the castle, where Sloth this morning fell beneath his sword?" "He is still there," replied the musical voice of Pleasure. "He finds much to arrange, and much to do, but will leave ere the sun goes down." "He must not leave it till the night dew falls," cried the giant, leaning forward on his seat, and speaking in a low, earnest tone. "Hie thou to yon castle, Pleasure. Spread there for him a table that may lure him to delay. Load it with rich wines and the daintiest food. Make it tempting, as thou knowest how to make it." Pleasure had learned many a recipe from old Gluttony, her neighbour, and, confident in her own powers, only answered the giant by a smile. "There is no moon to–night," continued Selfishness. "If he tarry till dark, he is my prey. Then, when he sets forth from Castle Sloth, do thou, with a lantern in thine hand, dance before him like the wildfire on the waste. Draw him from the path which he should pursue. Lead him on to the deep pit in the woods which I have dug to catch wanderers like him." Pleasure bowed as she received the command, spread her gossamer wings, and flew off. A heavy day was it with Giant Selfishness. His mind was full of anxiety and fear. What if the chosen knight should resist the temptation? If, resolute in the way pointed out by Conscience, he should neither indulge in the dainties so treacherously provided, nor follow the light sent to mislead. As the night closed in, and the scene grew darker and darker, with huge strides the giant sought his pit in the wood. There, like a wild beast lurking in his den, he awaited the approach of Fides. He dared not stand the stroke of the invincible sword, but he might slay his foe if taken at disadvantage. Ah, how many times whilst indulging in the feast of gluttony had Fides heard the faint warning voice of conscience! But, proud of his success in his conflict with Sloth, he regarded not warning nor danger. The sound of the clock fell unheeded on his ear, and not till the darkening shades told of the approach of night, till the glass ceased to sparkle, and all grew dim, did he slowly rise to depart. Giant Selfishness crouched by his pit in the woods, and listened for the sound of footsteps. For a long space he heard only the rustling of the leaves, as the night wind moaned through the forest. The stars scarcely gleamed in the dark blue sky, through openings in the driving clouds. At length a light appeared at a distance, and by its yellow flickering beams the giant knew it to be the torch of Pleasure. On it came, nearer and more near, and now the flash of its gleam upon armor, and the sound of a footstep on the forest path, showed that a knight was fast following behind. Then Giant Selfishness rubbed his huge hands with delight. "He who follows only pleasure," he muttered, "will be sure to fall into my pit." The sword of Fides hung by his side. It was not in his hand, for he found it encumber him as he passed through the thicket. He was not on the watch for a foe. He thought of nothing but the gay light before him. Suspecting no danger, he pressed on with rapid step. Then, ha! There was the sound of a crash and a cry. He had reached the pit. He had set his foot on the edge. He had fallen into the snare of Selfishness. The fall did not kill him, though the pit was deep. Perhaps his wondrous armor protected him from severe injury. But he was bruised, mortified, and discouraged. And the giant whose art had thrown him into this dark prison was resolved to keep him in it till he should perish by a slow, lingering death, as thousands had done before him. But Fides, the conqueror of Sloth, was not one to remain a captive to Selfishness without making an effort to escape. He was not content to be shut out from usefulness and glory. He had fallen, indeed, through his careless walk, but he might yet struggle up to freedom. As soon as the knight fully understood his position, he began to attempt to climb the sides of the pit. For the armor which had been given to him never encumbered his motions, though strong in battle, it yet sat light on the wearer as a garment of silk. A few small twigs of the creeping plant which in that land is called Desire of Approbation gave some little hold for his fingers as he tried the difficult ascent. With great effort he reached about 1/3 of the height. Then the spray which he grasped broke off in his hand, and he fell again heavily to the bottom, while the laugh of the giant, from the brink of the pit, mocked his disappointment and pain. Fides was not, however, altogether discouraged. He resolved to take a better and surer way. His own strength would not suffice, but then he had his sword. He would cut out resting places for his feet in the soft wall of the pit, and thus find a method to rise. He cut them, with a strong and patient hand, as far as his arm would reach, with many a thought of his king. He placed his foot on the first, raised his other to the second, and then, difficult as the task had become, and sorely as his arm ached with the exertion, scooped out 2 more little notches above his head. It was dark, and the giant, who, kneeling by the edge, with his head bent down, was glaring into the pit, could not see his intended victim. But he heard the sound of the earth as it fell, and caught a glimpse of the point of the sword, working its difficult way. "Ha! that must be put a stop to," cried Selfishness, as, hastily gathering together a heap of stones, earth, and turf, he hurled it down in the direction of the climber. The mass fell first on the sword, the invincible sword, which the weight of a mountain would not have snapped. This broke the force of the blow, but it was still sufficient to dash the weapon from the hand of Fides, and hurl the knight once more to the bottom. Now was Fides in sore dismay, and much he repented having lingered so long at the feast, and forgotten Conscience to follow Pleasure. He felt almost tempted to despair of ever getting out of the pit of Selfishness. He felt in the dark for his sword. He found it, and tried its edge. It was keen and perfect as ever. Then, remembering the words of Conscience, in his distress he breathed upon the hilt. In a moment a faint light shone in his little prison from the star wreath round the brow of his friend. "O Conscience!" exclaimed the unhappy prisoner, "never before hast thou seen me in such woeful case. Must I remain buried alive in this pit? Am I shut out from the kingdom for ever?" "Thou must climb," replied Conscience. "Though thou hast fallen thrice, he who perseveres must be successful at length." "But my limbs are bruised and weary, my strength is half spent. When I rise a little way, down comes a shower of earth, which throws me back into my dungeon. I have nothing firm upon which to lay hold, nothing to help me to rise from these depths." "Look this way," said Conscience. "See what has been placed here to enable poor captives to climb up from their dungeon." By the soft light which she threw around her, Fides perceived a cord of twisted silk and gold hanging from the top of the pit. "That," continued the guide, "is the strong cord of love. The bright scarlet twist is love towards man, the golden, stronger, holier love. The giant knows of this cord, and 1,000 times has tried to break, or loosen, or destroy it, but it is not in his power to do so. Sometimes, indeed, he draws it up, so that his victims cannot reach it. Either he has forgotten this precaution to night, or he has trusted that the darkness would hide from thee the means of safety and deliverance." Fides grasped the slender but firm cord of love, and with stronger hope and more steady resolution, again began his dangerous ascent. The climbing appears far easier now. His feet find the notches prepared in the wall, and relieve his arms of a portion of the weight. But Selfishness, meanwhile, is not idle above. Again he collects a heap of stones and of earth, but in the deep darkness, uncertain of his aim, while the mass comes crashing and thundering down, but a small portion actually strikes the knight. Another upward step, his hand is on the edge of the pit. One more, and his head rises above it. Then Giant Selfishness utters a cry of despair. He has no courage to cope with the invincible sword. He turns his back like a coward upon his foe, and is slain in the act of flight. Fides stood panting and breathless, scarcely believing his own victory, exhausted with his efforts, but rejoicing greatly in their success. With his drawn sword in his hand he stood, when a faint cry for mercy struck on his ear, and, caught in the thicket by her gossamer wings, her bright torch lying extinguished on the ground. By the dim twilight which was now appearing he recognized his false guide, Pleasure. Doubtful he stood with his weapon raised, unwilling to strike a creature so fair, unwilling to destroy what possessed such power to charm, yet resolved to do his duty, whatever it might cost him. "O Conscience!" he cried, "come now to my aid. Must pleasure be destroyed when sin is overcome?" The starry one was again beside him. "Hold thy hand," she exclaimed, "and let pleasure live. now that her master, Giant Selfishness, is slain. She shall be thy servant, even as she was his, but she must first learn how to perform higher, nobler tasks than any to which she was accustomed with him. I will place her beneath the care of Benevolence, where all her better nature will be drawn out. Her office no longer to lead thee astray, but to follow thy footsteps in the path of duty, and remain thy companion for ever." "I am glad that poor Pleasure was not killed," exclaimed Laura. "A dull life she would have of it with Benevolence," observed Constantine. "I don't think so," said Aleck, glancing up from his drawing; "and I am certain, at least, that it would be a much longer one than if she had remained the servant of Selfishness." "How do you make that out?" exclaimed several voices. "Why, Pleasure is fairly worn out by Selfishness," replied Aleck, who was naturally a reflecting boy. "He kills her by working her too hard. The greedy boy eats for pleasure, suffers for it afterwards, and pleasure is destroyed. The selfish boy thinks of nothing but his own amusement. No one cares for him, no one loves him, and pleasure is destroyed. The—" "The moral is this," interrupted Mrs. Roby, who saw that her son was treading upon dangerous ground. "Our business is not too eagerly to follow pleasure, but if we do our duty, pleasure will follow us. What mere selfish enjoyment can compare with the delight of feeling that we have cheered the sad and helped the distressed, that we have poured sweetness into a bitter cup, or led one poor wanderer into the right way? This is a pleasure that will never die. It is a pleasure like that which is enjoyed in heaven." Chapter 5